Hey everyone, I just sat down for a fascinating conversation with Casey Handmer, CEO and founder of Terraform Industries. We talked about solar power, reindustrialization, 10xing the world's energy demand, so I think you're going to love it. It's a fabulous conversation, hope you enjoy. Casey, you've said solar cells are panes of glass that print wealth. Flesh that out for us.
Solar modules are inert devices that are mostly glass and a little bit of aluminum that sit out in the sun and produce electricity, one of the highest grade forms of energy that we know about. No moving parts, no specialized labor, no specialized materials, no radioactivity, no nothing. Electricity is a form of wealth. It can be converted into almost any other kind of energy. In fact, here at Terraform, we're working on converting it into chemical energy. It's a pretty neat trick. And so when you think about what humans do with vast tracts of land, typically we will grow forests on them or row crops or graze animals in order to capture solar energy gradually in usable forms, either as structural materials or food for us or whatever. Solar modules do that, but about 100 times more effectively than the best plants.
People know about the amazing cost declines in solar, everyone's seeing the charts, but from someone that works in the industry, what are the most underrated innovations happening in solar that few people know about? What is actually driving down those learning curves?
Yeah, I'm actually not an expert in solar manufacturing per se. I'm vaguely aware of some efforts to innovate around use of silver and copper and a few other things like that. But mostly at this point, it's just thousands and thousands of tiny incremental improvements every day, driving down the cost. The thing that people underestimate about solar is that there are two factors at play here. One is that over time, increased deployments and newer factories means the solar modules get cheaper. And also over time, the fact that the modules get cheaper increases their attractiveness and increases the size of their market. And provided one of those factors remains larger than the other, this process will continue to accelerate. And the reality is that they're not even close. The market is increasing by about 6 times faster than the price is decreasing per unit increase in production volume, which means that it's unlikely that that manufacturing will ever catch up until we hit fundamental physical flaws on how cheaply we can produce solar energy. So it's just there's no chance that we're going to saturate demand here.
I still meet a lot of smart people who are anti-solar or think it's not going to work. Do you think those people just haven't looked at the innovation happening in solar? They haven't updated their priors recently enough?
I think people in general, myself included, find it quite attractive to get stuck on interesting things, one thing or another. They like what they like. And some people really like nuclear power. Some people really like coal or gas or whatever. And there are good reasons to like all these forms of power. So, and obviously I've been electricity from solar pilled for quite a while. At the end of the day, the thing about the solar industrial revolution, which is occurring right now, is that it's not requiring anyone's permission or enthusiasm for it to happen. Right? It's got to the point where the hand of the free market is essentially doing the work for it. Kind of irrespective of whether you like solar or not, enough people in the market like it that it's being deployed at massive scale, in the hundreds and hundreds of gigawatts per year. It reached critical mass or takeoff about 10 years ago, and the fact that I think a lot of people are still kind of running around trying to figure out how to ramp up nuclear or how to ramp up gas production or something for electricity just kind of speaks to the fact that humans have a lot of recency bias or kind of lock-in. And we saw this in COVID. Relatively few people seem naturally able to kind of understand the implications of exponential processes that are occurring in real time.
Is there some, people talk about the intermittency in solar, nighttime, all that stuff. Obviously, batteries play a huge part here. Is there still one intelligent argument against the future dominated by solar that you kind of like, that could be a case. That's maybe why we don't get 95% of our solar or for our energy from solar in 2042, or in your mind, is it completely de-risked at this point?
It's completely de-risked at this point. Even if we achieve no further improvements in solar cost, all of our electricity infrastructure would move over to solar and batteries, at essentially the current rate of factory production. But of course, production is actually increasing roughly 50% year over year. So it won't take all that long to get there. I think it's still meaningful to say, well, what are the fundamental constraints on deploying solar, right? Like, is there an element involved in them which is so rare in the crust that we're going to run out of it? And the answer to that is no, not even close. Or is the crust itself so rare that like we just don't have enough area to put to put all the solar panels down, and that's also not the case. So, for example, if we just want to cut, our existing 18 terawatts of global electricity supply over to solar and batteries, it requires less area overall than we've already used for rooftops and paved areas, structure, the parking lots and roads and things like that. Of course, in practice, you probably wouldn't only put the solar on rooftops, but it's just not very much area in the grand scheme of things. And if you, in addition to that, also want to move all of our chemical energy, which is to say, via synthetic fuels, which is what we're working on here at Terraform, over to solar, it would be about 2 or 3% total of our global land surface area, which is, it sounds like a lot. It's roughly 2 or 3 times the total area of all our cities, but it's also about 1/10 of the total area of our intensive agriculture. So it's not even including forestry. And again, it wouldn't be the same land, right? You don't take your prime agricultural land and pave it with solar. You take the deserts or the brownfields or the swamps or kind of other areas of economically unproductive land, and you put solar on them, and that's where you get your energy from. So it's kind of remarkable that something like a third of the Earth's land surface area is functionally uninhabited because it's either too dry, too hot, or too cold, or whatever. And just by putting a solar array, just your inert pane of glass, your kind of sheet of glass that prints out wealth down on that land, it now becomes easily 100 times more economically productive than the best farmland on Earth. This is pretty remarkable.
First time I ever heard about Terraform Industries, the idea absolutely blew my mind. So blow all the viewers' minds, tell them what Terraform is working on, how it works, the progress, all that good stuff.
Yeah, so Terraform is building machinery that allows us to take ultra cheap solar power and produce unlimited quantities of cheap synthetic natural gas and ultimately other hydrocarbon products from nothing other than sunlight and air, right? Now, this sounds absolutely crazy, but if you think about it, where oil and gas come from is ancient forests and swamps and things, which gathered their reduced carbon biomass from sunlight and air also. Only it took them millions of years to do what will take us, weeks. And again, that's because the solar and physical chemical synthesis process is hundreds of times more efficient than natural photosynthesis. So it's a very neat trick. Conventionally we think, well, a lot of the energy we use is oil or gas, and a lot of it comes from particular places on the Earth where it just happens to occur naturally, and almost always those places are a very long way away from where people who need them are. The exception to that is in the United States, where there's a number of oil fields, kind of conveniently collocated with human cities. But usually, if you're getting your gasoline, it came out of the ground halfway around the world, and that's not the case with solar, right? If you think about human population distribution, pretty much hasn't changed all that much since we invented refrigeration, which means 100 years ago, people lived within a day's walk of where they could grow enough food to survive. And if you can grow enough food to survive, you have enough solar power to power all your cities and all your industry with solar. So I think in the not very distant future, kind of this world where our energy kind of comes out of the ground in Saudi Arabia and ends up on a ship, and then spends weeks on a ship traversing the world's oceans in order to go through this incredibly complicated, extended, expensive delivery infrastructure system will kind of go away, and we'll return to something a bit more like what we had in, say, 1850 or 1900, only instead of being stuck behind the energy productivity of unoptimized crops subject to various natural blights and without artificial nitrogen fertilizer, we'll have the ability to feed our entire industrial machinery as well as ourselves with kind of super abundant energy that is more or less produced in our own backyards.
What are the second order consequences of that? It seems like it's just such a huge shift than what we've had for the past 100 years.
Yeah, I mean, there's a whole bunch of neat consequences. I think the critical one is that people's strategic vulnerability to supply chain interruptions will diminish quite a bit. Right now there's a large fraction of the world's developing world and developed world get their oil from places they have no ability to the countries have no ability to secure the supply chains, either at their source or in between. That's a kind of a bit of a headache. If you're Japan or South Korea or something like that, essentially any number of 10 or 15 countries between you and your oil could have a bad day, and you wouldn't get oil anymore, and your entire civilization would grind to a halt within weeks. And so that's going to go away. And I think this is overwhelmingly a positive thing for humanity. I think that also having kind of unconditional hydrocarbon abundance will help lift the remaining billions of people out of poverty and bring them up to ultimately US or even Texan levels of per capita oil consumption, something like 50 barrels per person per year. At the current global average, something like one or two barrels per person per year. So just unconditional material abundance, energy abundance, and wealth that you and I take for granted because we fly in jet planes when we want to, but most people never get to do that. And so we can bring that up. And at the same time, I think that we probably have to take a hard look at certain geostrategic containment strategies that we've used to, particularly in East Asia, that will also kind of lose their efficacy if the countries there are no longer dependent on the largesse of, say, the US Navy to keep their oil supply lines open.
So it's kind of like almost like robotics could be good for demographically challenged countries. This could be good for energy poor nations. It could basically rewrite their destiny.
Well, what if I told you that all nations are energy poor? Right?
Say
Compared
more.
to what we will have, they are all poor. Compared to what we had 100 years ago, we're all rich. Just to make it more explicit, right now, one of the major reasons that China can't invade Taiwan is that if they do, Japan or India or Australia or anyone really can close the Straits of Malacca, and then China can't get oil. And they have some of their own domestic oil supply, and they have some stockpiles and so on, but they don't have enough to meet their ongoing demand, which is about 12 million barrels a day. But if they're able to produce all their oil within their own borders using a solar synthetic process, that will no longer be a concern of theirs.
Back to the Terraform Industries, just talk me through how the Terraformer actually works, what it does exactly.
That's a great question. I mean, our desire as a producer of this technology is that it's just a box that you put out in the field and gas comes out the side. And if you squint your eyes, it just looks like a gas well, right, or an oil well. We drill a hole in the ground and out comes the black liquid that's so valuable. But of course, inside it's full of all kinds of magical components. So just to kind of break it down a bit for your listeners here, we have a direct air capture component that captures CO2 out of the air. So its major task is just taking CO2 that naturally occurs in air anywhere on Earth and concentrating it to 99% purity or thereabouts. We have an electrolyzer. The electrolyzer takes in water, which we can get out of the air as well, and puts in a huge amount of electricity and splits it into oxygen and hydrogen. And like plants, we throw the oxygen away. It's a waste product. And it's actually not valuable enough to be worth capturing and exploiting. But we keep the hydrogen. And the hydrogen becomes kind of the next step in the energy chain. And then we have a synthetic chemistry reactor. So this is old school German high pressure, high temperature catalytic chemistry of the sort that was developed initially in the late 1800s and early 1900s and has been used to make artificial fertilizer. And with essentially the same reaction, we put in CO2 and hydrogen and we get out methane. We also have a methanol reactor in the works. And it's a pretty cool thing because this process has been custom engineered by us to be able to operate intermittently. That is to say, when the sun comes up, it turns on. When the sun goes down, it turns off. And to be built cheaply enough, that is with a low enough capex, that it still has good return on investment, good rate of return. And both those things to do together are quite challenging, which is why we've hired an incredible team here of engineers and technicians and scientists and so on to help us build this system. And we are hiring, so we have many jobs open at our website, terraformindustries.com. You should come and work with us. We think we're actually the best company on earth for ambitious people to really level up their skills doing new kinds of problems that will be very relevant to the next few decades of human economic development. So once you take all these three subsystems together, electricity and air goes in one side and natural gas comes out the other side. It's a pretty neat trick. Formerly, if you didn't happen to be in Texas or Saudi Arabia and you wanted energy, you had to buy it from someone else at whatever the going rate was. And in the 1970s, this became pretty bad news because Texan oil production was no longer able to undermine the oil cartel OPEC, and they were able to push their prices up quite a bit. And it was one of the, I think, factors that led to a kind of economic slowdown and malaise that's affected the rest of us for about 50 years. If you lose the geographic lottery, it's tough. But as I said before, basically everywhere that humans live, there's enough solar power to make synthetic fuel. So as long as you can throw solar panels out on the ground, just inert, lifeless chunks of glass that spit out wealth, and plug them into a terraformer, you can have all the oil and gas your heart could ever desire.
I wasn't going to go there yet, but you triggered me. WTF happened in 1971. Should it really be WTF happened in 1973?
It's a really good question. A whole bunch of different things happened, kind of at the same time, and some of them were positive and some of them negative, right? So I think in terms of, here we are in 2025 looking back, the oil shocks were a major cause of kind of economic uncertainty, and I think also the decline of heavy industry in the West, because it's really hard to make kind of 20, 30-year investments on the basis of like predictable reductions in oil price if your oil prices are all over the place and you just don't know what they're going to be in 10 years' time. That's a real challenge. And then the other major thing that happened, at least in the United States that period, and I think also occurred largely in Europe and Australia, was that the kind of environmental conservation movement, which I think was well-intentioned, managed to get past a bunch of laws that subsequent interpretations have basically made extremely difficult for us to build anything. And I'm talking here about, in the United States, about NEPA and CEQA, that basically create these insane barriers between people who want to use their own money to build machines and devices that help the world move forward, and people who are happy to use these kind of legacy laws to slow down progress. And then on the positive side, also in the 1970s, we had the development of, or the early days of personal computing. And I think that ultimately drove kind of a series of revolutions in silicon production that ultimately has given rise to personal computing, Apple cell phones, supercomputers in your pocket, GPUs, cryptocurrency, obviously AI, and also the development of the silicon industry to the point where solar, starting about 2009, could really begin to get its feet under it and start pushing forward towards this future. So I think, looking back, it might just be seen as this kind of unavoidable blip, that humanity kind of first runs up against the limitations, the finiteness of without loss of generality, reduced carbon energy sources in the crust, and has to kind of work through that process. And we were able to use computers as a economic forcing function to bootstrap our ability to use silicon in a way that's economically useful at scale. But now it's 2025. It's time to hit the gas and correct some of these mistakes of the past, and make sure that we don't any longer put off this great future, and that we don't rob our children of the future. And actually, you mentioned earlier, like robots and demographic collapse, and I think one of the reasons why we've seen a major decline in the number of children that people are having is because people look in the future and they do see uncertainty, they do see scarcity, they do fear that the future won't have this kind of unlimited boundaries or unlimited frontiers for humanity to expand. And I think that's old news since about 2012, which is when solar first got cheaper than coal. But I think that it's been relatively slow. Our culture has been relatively slow in the uptake. On the other hand, in my world of the kind of technocratic weirdos and founders and so on, I think it's actually pretty common to have as many children as you can once you find the right person. So just amongst my friend group, a lot of people are going for 3, 4, the third, the fourth, the fifth child, and it helps that these people are relatively prosperous overall. But I think they're kind of leading the rest of the culture in terms of their ability to see a future that's radically abundant for everyone.
Yeah, Palmer Luckey said it's un-American to have less than 2.1 kids. I agree.
I don't know how many children he has at this point, so
I think he's only on one, so we're both beating him. Just talk me through the economics of the terraformer. Is it the cost to produce synthetic natural gas today versus just fracking it in the ground? Just talk through me all those numbers, and then is somewhere in the world that it would be economical today? For example, gas prices are a lot higher in Europe.
Yeah, so plenty of people have tried to do synthetic fuels in the past, dating back into the 1920s, and the challenge is to be able to produce it at a cost that someone wants to buy it, at meaningful volumes, right? We talked about this at the very beginning in terms of saturating the demand, and as long as you can continue to reduce the cost over time faster than at the same rate at least that you're expanding the market by reducing that cost, then you're okay. But if your entry point is 10 times the going rate and no one wants to pay that, then you're out of luck. Now, for us, I kind of alluded earlier to intermittency and low capex, and those are the keys, right? Because if you have low capex, then that allows you to pass on something like 80% of the future cost savings of solar. So if you say, well, I'm pretty sure that solar is going to get much cheaper in the future. How do I have a short position on the future price of solar? The answer is you want to go and build machines that consume an enormous amount of solar. Those machines have to be relatively cheap, so they have good investment rate of return. And so that as the solar gets cheaper, you can pass that cost saving on to your customers. This is Costco business model, scale economy shared 101. That's what we set out to do here, right? So as long as we can keep our synthetic fuel machinery cheap enough and continue to reduce the cost over time, then we can plug it into a solar array that's also getting cheaper over time and continue to pull that cost down. So that's the general theory. Now let's get into the actual numbers. If you wanted to go out right now and buy a Terraformer-like device from one of the legacy engineering companies in Europe or United States, it would probably cost you about $10 million per megawatt or $10,000 per kilowatt. That's so expensive that you definitely want to run it 24 hours a day. So you're going to run it off grid power, which means you can be paying between $100 and $150 per megawatt hour for electricity. And because you're paying so much, you want a very high efficiency electrolyzer. So your electrolyzer alone is going to cost $3,000 or $4,000 a kilowatt. And pretty soon you're in a situation where your green hydrogen is costing $10 to $15 per kilogram, and your natural gas product is, if you've got a 0% interest sweetheart loan and a 30-year amortization and your machinery never breaks down and it requires no input labor, and you also get the solar effectively for free, then you're looking at like $50 to $100 per 1,000 cubic feet, which is not a great price. For reference, countries that are importing natural gas from the United States right now are paying typically in the teens, which is a pretty good price. I don't think it's going to get much better than that in the future because demand is only increasing. And places that are sitting right on top of gas wells, Texas or New Mexico or whatever, typically paying $1 or $2 per 1,000 cubic feet. And actually most of what you're paying for there is the transportation cost. The gas itself is actually a byproduct of fracking for oil. And so it's artificially cheap. If you were just fracking purely for gas, pure play gas frac, such as in Pennsylvania, you're talking more like $9 or $10 per 1,000 cubic feet just to break even on that. So that's kind of the long-term cost target for us, about $10. In order to do that, I just kind of run you through the math. Like right now, we're able to produce hydrogen for under $2.50 per kilogram and CO2 for under $250 a ton. So if you're following along and you run the math, that's this is last year now. Our synthetic fuel price is in the 30s of dollars per 1,000 cubic feet. So that's not great, but we're a small prototyping company. Right now, we're building our first full-scale system. That's going to pull our respective prices for hydrogen and CO2 down into about the $1.50 and $150 range, which will in turn make the natural gas price about $20. And $20 for natural gas you can produce in your own backyard. This is starting to look extremely compelling in Europe and Asia. And actually, conventional wisdom would say, well, this is no use in Denmark because Denmark doesn't get enough sun. But again, remember that that natural gas is readily storable. Once it comes out of our machine, you can store it. If it's methanol, you can store it in a big tank. And so, kind of what you lose in winter, you can make up for in summer. It turns out that the natural solar abundance in Denmark is only a couple, 10 or 20% worse than, say, central Germany, which is again about 10% worse than, say, southern Italy. It doesn't make a huge difference in the grand scheme of things because solar is getting 10, 15, 20% cheaper per year anyway. Okay, but so that's around $20. What does it take to get down to like $10? To get to $10 per 1,000 cubic feet for natural gas, we need our hydrogen to be about 60 cents a kilo. Now, just to be clear here, when we get under $1.50 for hydrogen, we are competitive with steam methane reforming. So at that point, we are ready to go and be large-scale hydrogen suppliers for the Haber-Bosch synthetic ammonia industry, for example. And we need our CO2 to be around $60 a ton. That's going to take a couple more years of development at least. The good news is on the way there, as I alluded to, we have the ability to sell either products or separate products, methanol, for example, ammonia. We're also looking at steel and desalinated water using basically the same technology, but oriented towards a different primary material at a much better price for us. That is, so natural gas is we started at natural gas because it's the easiest of these things to make, right? It's a pure gas phase product, and the synthesis reaction is relatively simple. But it will also be our final boss battle, right? Like getting to the point where we can produce natural gas at a price where we can push frackers ultimately out of the market in markets where they have local off-takers is going to take probably another decade or maybe 15 years of further development on current cost curves to get there. So it's kind of a fun kind of parenthetical thing. We start with natural gas, then we use that expertise to move sideways into methanol, where we can probably, so we're kind of at cost parity already, on paper at least, and the steel and so on, and other metals, and then we take the benefit of all this learning and we continue to pour it back into natural gas and continue to scale up, and ultimately we're able to get natural gas and all our products down to prices that are not just competitive in today's market, but actually I think easily a factor of 2 better than today's best prices. This is also critically important, right? It's one thing if you can create natural gas at what is considered a good price, say for Japan in your own backyard today. It's quite another thing if you're able to produce steel for $500 a ton, right? Or any of these things at half the current price. It's really cheap, reliable, friend sourced or onshored production of all the primary materials is absolutely key to kind of supporting future economic growth.
Where will we see a terraformer in the wild first?
Here in Southern California. Yeah. So it's actually like one of the major obstacles we face here is permitting difficulties. California is kind of a famously overregulated environmental state. And I just never missed an opportunity to get on my hobby horse about this. I have to go through more permitting to install a solar array that's going to produce carbon neutral synthetic fuel than I would have to build a conventional chemical plant, right? And in some of the land that we're looking at, I can by right clear out brush and park rusting trucks and build a junkyard with 0 permits whatsoever if I own the land. But I can't put out a solar array. In some of these places, you have to do a 4-year environmental impact statement and report running to tens of thousands of pages to put out a solar array on the very same land that's already zoned heavy industrial, or even like adjacent residentially zoned desert land. I can just put like rusting machinery that leaks oil into the aquifer, and it's completely legal. So like, it's absolutely insane that we've kind of built ourselves into this corner with environmental regulations that actively inhibit our ability to roll out solar. Now, fortunately, everyone understands this, and a number of pretty talented people are fighting hard against it, and including us. We are going to prevail here. It is just a matter of time before like the sanity and the rationality of deploying solar at scale in the desert, which is actually like, arguably it has a positive environmental impact because you're shading the ground. It actually improves moisture retention and helps plants and animals grow. It's certainly far better than like paving over it or building buildings on it or something like that. It's also much easier to reverse. If in 30 years you decide you want to take the solar down, you just send some guys out and pick them up and put them back in a truck and off you go. It goes back to being desert. So we're gonna deploy here in Southern California. We're gonna run the gauntlet of the environmental permitting process, and we're gonna prevail.
I know you're going to do it. When you walk into Casey's HQ, there's a big sticker saying "We will win." It's very, very motivational. I've heard you mentioned the desert. I've heard 2 visions for what we do with the desert. One is, using desalination to turn it into lush green farmland, something like that. The other is maybe paving over it with solar panels. Are we going to do both of those? What's the most compelling vision or the most important vision for you?
There's no shortage of desert. So I think, in the near term, most of the desert will stay as desert, and it probably should stay as desert. But you can put out solar arrays and desalination machinery and start to green the desert. And the overhead for that in terms of area is less than 0.5%. So you take, I don't know, 1,000 acres of desert, and you put 5 acres under solar, and you can irrigate the rest with desalination. So this is widely underappreciated, but like, we have millions and millions of acres of incredible land, undeveloped land in Nevada. We could literally, and there used to be rivers there. There were rivers there 10,000 years ago because the climate was different back then. We could, with technology we've had for a century, terraform it. Some of these, about 100 different valleys in Nevada, we could pick, say, a dozen of them and kind of run rivers between all these different valleys with fresh water that we send in from the coast. And those valleys could be developed, beautiful, lush areas for humans to live, create more living space for people. And then, of course, 1 or 2 of the adjacent valleys can be covered in solar to produce all the oil and gas that the United States would ever need. And that still leaves, at my count, 85 valleys of undeveloped barren desert left over. So there's no shortage here.
I know you're not just talking about this, you've crunched some numbers. Sounds like a great idea to me. Sounds so obvious. Why aren't we doing it?
Again, I think this is some kind of anchoring bias or recency bias that conventional wisdom would tell you that the desalination is far too expensive. It's not anymore. It's actually there are parts of the world where you can desalinate seawater with current technology for 40 cents per cubic meter, which is easily cheap enough that you can use it to grow cash crops at scale. So like there's all this news about like Saudi Arabia buying up farmland in Arizona and growing alfalfa and then flying it by plane over to beef feedlots in Saudi Arabia and like using up this precious fossil water that we have in Arizona. Well, it's crazy. Arizona's only about 10 miles from the coast. Sure, we're going to have to sign a deal with the Mexicans to have access to their ocean. But you could literally desalinate all the fresh water you could ever want and grow as much alfalfa as you want in Arizona's incredible farmland and ship it to the Saudis and everyone else on earth just to flex how good we are at making water. And of course, there's plenty for the Mexicans too, right? Like this kind of long simmering battle between about 14 different states that depend on the Colorado, as well as Sonora and Baja, Mexico. It can just be like wiped away with a stroke of the pen and like a year or two of frantic development. And then that entire area of the world can go from this like parched place where like a bunch of farmers are like right on the edge of survival and like horrible salinity and all kinds of problems to being the most abundant farmland on earth. We could literally do that. So again, people think that this technology is expensive, but it isn't anymore.
You recently tweeted out 1,640 days until China takes the moon. Say more. What's going on in space?
Well, now it's 1,635 days. It's been a week. Yeah, so I've been kind of thinking a lot about NASA. NASA's a place I worked for 4 years. Really an incredible place to work and a place I really enjoyed working at. Not without its challenges, of course, but certainly plenty of opportunities to learn and really incredible people. NASA spends $20 billion a year. It's roughly its budget. It's equivalent to like 2 times the Manhattan Project. The Manhattan Project went from like, we think uranium might be able to do chain reactions to functioning nuclear weapons in 3.5 years in the middle of the worst war in history. And yet NASA's been spending $20 billion a year for, well, essentially forever. And we have no moon base. We have no moon rocket. We have no, we have 15 NASA centers, and like, what are they actually doing? There's this clear overhang here in terms of productivity. And it was obvious enough when I was working there that like a bunch of very smart people not working very quickly. And at least by comparison to the private sector. And I think a lot of people in the space sector recognize this, and they were extremely excited that Jared Isaacman was going to have an opportunity to go in there because like going in to fix NASA is painting a giant target on your back for the rest of your life. There's a lot of constituencies there who would be very upset by like not even taking away their toys, but like moving them around a bit, and they can play real nasty. So what do you do about that? But Jared stuck his hand up because he's pathologically brave and because he understands this country has given him something that he wants to repay, and good on him. And for essentially like extremely unfortunate reasons related to an unrelated political fight, he got spiked at the last moment. And so that really makes me worry. Like NASA's essentially been on life support for years. And now it's like not clear who's going to go in there and straighten things out. And the problem is if they don't straighten things out, then China will take the moon by the end of 2029, as they have stated numerous times and have been building towards. And China builds more rockets than anyone else. And United States launches more rockets, but that's because SpaceX recycles rockets. China does not yet recycle rockets. They still drop them on villages, which tell you everything you need to know about China's attitude to space and their dedication and determination to go and basically do what they say they're going to do. And they might land on the moon and visit and plant a flag and say some nice words like Neil and Buzz did back in 1969. Or they might claim all the territory around the poles and then say, this is our sovereign land, it's ours. By the way, Taiwan is ours as well, and bugger off, we have nuclear weapons. The Chinese Communist Party is not really accountable to international norms, as we've seen. So this is something I'm deeply concerned about. And NASA's job, NASA was formed in 1958 in response to Sputnik, which occurred in 1957, which scared the absolute crap out of everyone in the West. And like DARPA, NASA's job was no more surprises. Like United States claims an interest in space, just as we do in South America. And we encourage everyone to play there, but kind of under our rules. And it's NASA's job to uphold that. It's NASA's job to make sure that there's never any doubt amongst the next generation that US, the better part of US principles of freedom and democracy will end up ruling the light cone for the future of humanity forever. But that's not the case.
Is it first of all, why does the moon matter? Is it like you could put a nuclear weapon on there, or is it more of a kind of
It's symbolism, really. It's the same
right.
reason that Antarctica matters. I mean, Antarctica doesn't
Right.
really matter. Like, there's a bunch of Antarctic stations down there for each country that's a signatory to the Antarctic Treaty. And they're there for strategic reasons, right? Just kind of keep an eye on the place and maintain a claim on the various bits of land there that aren't covered in ice. And they're mostly staffed by scientists, because scientists will go there voluntarily, as opposed to by soldiers or the military or whatever. That's, I think, a good an analogy for how a lunar program could or should be run. But you don't, just because there's a bunch of land that is economically worthless to you, it doesn't mean that you really want to see your geopolitical adversaries setting up bases there and digging in. It would be a bad idea.
If Henry Kaiser was alive today, what would he be working on?
Oh, that is a good question. So for those of you who don't know, Henry Kaiser was a US-based industrialist, actually passed in, I think, 1968 or 1969, but he worked on ships and dams and roads and cars and planes and cement and steel and aluminum and magnesium and a bunch of other stuff. Inventor of the rubber-wheeled wheelbarrow, collaborator with Letourneau on diesel heavy equipment for road building and machinery. Really insanely innovative. He and his team today, well, they'd still be running Kaiser Permanente. I think that would be a major area of interest of theirs. They'd be doing solar deployment for sure. Absolutely. They would probably be partnering with us on synthetic fuel deployment, and we would be fortunate to have them. They would have done they would have fixed the Salton Sea decades ago. They would have started this terraforming of the desert process a long time ago. Probably Kaiser would have, if he was immortal, he would have gotten around to making cars and planes work as well. He had a really solid effort at cars and planes and ultimately didn't have a massive impact there. But I guess, well, Kaiser owned Willis Jeep for many years, which set up manufacturing in Brazil and Argentina. So I guess there was an international impact there. Just a fascinating character, and really kind of interesting in that, I think, a cautionary tale in the context of succession planning as well.
What do you think you would think about the reindustrialization movement?
We'd definitely be in favor. So what's actually underappreciated is that the Kaiser companies actually went all over the world and set up industrialization there as well, much as I think the Ford Motor Company did, kind of prior to the Second World War. So I was doing some research into this and realized that Australia has a fairly substantial aluminum industry. And it was basically all set up by Kaiser's companies, as does India, as does a lot of places in Europe. I don't have a comprehensive list, but I genuinely believe that massive fraction of the world's aluminum and steel industries and stuff post-war was set up by or in collaboration with the Kaiser companies, which is kind of mind-blowing.
Back to what you're working on at Terraform, paint a vision for us for what we do with 10x more energy, specifically for people in rich countries.
Yeah,
all of us that get to fly in jet planes.
Yeah, so we already have large houses that we air condition. We already have data centers. We already have fast cars. We already fly in airplanes essentially as often as we want to. So you could leave the lights on in the bathroom overnight. That's not really going to substantially increase per capita energy consumption, right? And if you look at parts of the United States that consume a lot of energy, say Texas or the Northeast, it's generally for seasonal heating and cooling, right? So that's basically air conditioning. It turns out moving heat around is incredibly energy intensive. So if you think about the appliances that you use that have really thick power cords, how could you say 10x your consumption of those appliances? There's consumption of appliances. I don't have a comprehensive answer on this, but I think that obviously, renewed economic growth and vigor will result in increased consumption of primary materials, steel, cement, in particular, aluminum for just construction of new cities. That's a big increase in consumption. Renewal of cities, for example, a lot of our cities, most of the cement was poured 50 years ago. It's going to have to be pulled down and rebuilt. And then the two very interesting and fairly obvious growth areas that I quite like are AI supercomputing. Right, so on a per human capita basis, your consumption of computing will continue to increase probably between 20 and 30% per year. And And then the other one is aviation. So in terms of things that you do that consume vast quantities of energy in a short period of time, aviation is basically it. So we can switch you and I over to supersonic aircraft, which will consume roughly 10 times more fuel per capita at the same time as we bring, say another 500 million people into the jet set class. So about 50 million people worldwide fly jets semi-routinely today. So maybe 500 million people will get to fly jets routinely, and then the rest of the world will fly intermittently as we continue to develop. But currently aviation consumes something like 2% of global oil and gas supply, and it serves less than 1% of the world's population. So there's obviously plenty of room for growth there.
I know we're coming up on time here, Casey, so maybe just to end, play a fun little game. So I'm going to name 12 technologies. You tell me if they're overrated, underrated, or you can use properly rated as well, okay?
Sure.
Okay. LLMs,
Underrated.
humanoid robotics,
Underrated.
CRISPR,
Underrated. Immortality.
mRNA,
Yeah. Underrated. Incredible.
embryo selection.
It's correctly rated, but it's part of a larger constellation of technologies that are extremely underrated.
Nanotechnology,
Overrated.
geothermal,
Massively overrated. Sorry.
Starship,
Underrated.
the Golden Dome,
Correctly rated.
in-orbit manufacturing,
Overrated.
brain-computer interfaces.
Underrated.
Last one, drones.
Incredibly underrated. Lol.
Maybe, yeah, for sure. Casey, maybe end with, I know you started Terraform in your garage. You've come such a long way and it's amazing to see what you're building. Maybe for a young rational optimist listening who is perhaps embarking on their own world-changing ideas, what's the most important piece of advice that you'd offer them?
Well, it's an adventure, isn't it? Yeah, if you kind of are obsessed with something and determined to see something exist in the world and there doesn't currently exist a market mechanism to make it real and no one else is doing it, well, you're it. It's like your unborn children. They're depending on you to make them real. And yeah, you can just do things. Trademark.
Casey Handmer, CEO and founder of Terraform Industries, thank you so much for your time and hope we can do it again.
Of course. Thank you for having me.